In 1347, death arrived in the Genoese colony of Caffa, located on the shores of the Black Sea. It came not with a sword, nor with fire, but with something far more terrible, a disease that caused people to die in agony within days. Corpses were piled up at the city walls, and the living watched in horror as their loved ones became covered in black sores and suffocated in their final moments. No one then knew that this was merely the beginning of the greatest catastrophe that would engulf a third of Europe's population and forever change the course of history. The Middle Ages, an era spanning from the 5th to the 10th century, was a time of great achievements and terrifying disasters. Hidden between majestic cathedrals and nightly tournaments was another reality. Unsanitary conditions, ignorance in medicine, and diseases that mowed down people by the thousands. Cities grew, trade flourished, but along with merchant caravans, invisible enemies, the agents of deadly infections, traveled the roads of Europe. The life of a medieval person was short and full of dangers. Child mortality reached 50%, and those who survived constantly faced the threat of epidemics. Cities were clusters of wooden houses, pressed close together with narrow streets through which streams of filth flowed. There was no running water, no sewage system, and the concept of personal hygiene was alien to the majority of the population. In such conditions, any infection spread with alarming speed. Medical knowledge of that era was based on the ancient works of Galen and Hippocrates, but had been distorted by centuries of misinterpretations. Physicians believed in the theory of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and thought that illness arose from their imbalance. The main method of treatment was bloodletting. A doctor would open a vein with a sharp lancet, and blood would drain into a special bowl, carrying the disease away, as they believed. Sometimes leeches were used for this purpose, applied to the ailing area. The church played a huge role in the understanding of diseases. Many considered epidemics to be God's punishment for humanity's sins. When a plague struck a city, people would go on religious processions, pray, and repent, hoping to appease the angered Lord. Some would scourge themselves until they bled, believing that physical pain would purify the soul. But the disease did not retreat. It only grew stronger, devouring city after city, village after village. Before the Great Plague of the mid-14th century, Europe had already known many other terrible diseases. Leprosy tormented the continent from the 10th century onwards. It was a slow, agonizing death. The skin became covered with ulcers, limbs rotted and fell off, and faces were disfigured beyond recognition. Leper people were feared and hated. They were banished from society, publicly sung for in church, and sent to leper colonies, special shelters from which there was no return. A person declared a leper was considered a living dead. They could not marry, inherit property, or earn a living. Lepers were required to wear special clothing and warn healthy people of their approach by ringing a bell or shouting. If one of them dared to enter a city without warning, they could be stoned to death. Society showed no mercy to those afflicted by this disease, seeing in them not unfortunate sick individuals, but heretics and sinners punished by God. Leper colonies were built throughout Europe, grim stone structures outside city walls, where lepers lived out their days in isolation. By the 10th century, France alone had about 2,000 such shelters. Monks of various orders cared for the sick, risking their own lives. But the medicine of that time could offer no treatment. Lepers slowly faded away, and their bodies were buried in special cemeteries, separate from the burial places of healthy people. Long before the plague ravaged Europe, the continent experienced another terrible disease, known as holy fire, or St. Anthony's fire. In 857, a record appeared in the Xanten annals about a plague of ergotism that killed many people. The sick felt as if their limbs were burning from within. Their skin turned black and sloughed off, and their bodies convulsed. This was ergotism, poisoning from ergot, a parasitic fungus that infected rye. Rye was a staple food in medieval Europe. Peasants grew it in their fields, ground it into flour, and baked bread dark, coarse, but it gave them strength for hard labor. However, in rainy years, when humidity was high, black ergot kernels appeared on the ears of grain. These contained deadly alkaloids, which, when ingested by humans, caused hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene. People did not understand that the cause of their suffering was the bread they ate every day. In 944 and 945, Paris and Aquitaine were struck by a massive epidemic. More than 20,000 people died from holy fire, experiencing unbearable torment. The symptoms were horrifying. Limbs blackened and mummified. Fingers and entire body parts fell off without bleeding, like dried tree branches. People writhed in convulsions, saw terrifying visions, demons, hellfire, sinners in hell. Some, overcome by madness, threw themselves into fires or from heights, trying to escape the specters that pursued them. The church initially called the disease divine fire. It was believed to be a punishment for sins, and only prayer could save them from it. However, over time, monks of the Order of St. Anthony began to specialize in caring for ergotism patients. They built hospitals where they tried to alleviate the suffering of the unfortunate, and the disease began to be called St. Anthony's fire, after the patron saint of the order. The monks fed the sick with clean bread made from wheat, not infected with ergot, and many began to recover, although the mechanism of this miracle remained unclear. The hallucinogenic properties of ergot toxins affected not only individual patients but society as a whole. Modern researchers believe that ergotism may have been the cause of mass hysterias that swept through medieval Europe. Episodes of religious fanaticism, witch hunts, the cruelty of the Inquisition, all of this could have been amplified by the constant exposure to hallucinogenic toxins that people received from bread. They saw demons, witches, and sorcerers everywhere, and sincerely believed in the reality of these visions. Artists of that era captured the horrors of ergotism in their canvases. Hieronymus Bosch and Matthias Grunewald depicted patients with blackened limbs, figures writhing in convulsions, and fantastic hellish scenes. Some researchers suggest that Bosch himself may have painted his pictures under the influence of ergot toxins, which would explain the realism and nightmarish quality of his imagery. The medieval person constantly balanced on the edge between reality and hallucination, not understanding that the cause of their torment was hidden in the very foundation of their existence, in the daily bread. Ergotism epidemics continued throughout the Middle Ages, erupting with frightening regularity. They were particularly severe in lean years, when peasants were forced to use infected rye, having no other choice. Hunger forced people to eat everything that grew in the fields. Even if it brought death, the black ergot kernels were ground with the grain, and the poison entered the bodies of the entire family, from infants to the elderly. In the autumn of 1346, the Mongol army besieged the Genoese colony of Kaffa on the shores of the Black Sea. The siege dragged on, and suddenly a strange disease began to spread among the besiegers. Warriors died one after another, covered in black sores. Bloody foam came from their mouths, their bodies convulsed. The Mongol Khan, enraged by the failure, ordered the bodies of the dead to be catapulted over the city walls. This was one of the first instances of biological warfare in human history, and it had catastrophic consequences. Panic erupted within Kaffa. Genoese merchants, seeing how the disease was decimating the city's inhabitants, hastily loaded their goods onto ships and sailed into the Mediterranean Sea. They did not know that they were carrying not only spices and silk but also death. On board the ships were rats infected with plague fleas, which carried the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the agent of bubonic plague. These ships docked at the shores of Italy, France, and other European countries, and from them, the Black Death descended upon the continent. In 1348, the plague reached Avignon, the seat of the Pope. Chronicles testify that the disease struck the city with unprecedented force. People died so quickly that there were not enough graves for burials. Corpses were piled into mass graves in layers, sprinkled with lime. But even this did not help to cope with the number of deaths. Modern historians estimate that about 50% of Avignon's population perished from the plague. The clergy suffered particularly heavy losses. Priests who confessed the dying and performed rites over the dead were the first to become infected. The symptoms of the disease were horrifying. First, a person would develop chills and a high fever, then painful swellings, the size of a hen's egg or an apple, would appear in the groin, armpits, or neck. They blackened, filled with pus and blood, causing unbearable pain. The sick person would rave, vomit blood, and black spots would appear on the skin, traces of internal hemorrhages. Death occurred 3 to 5 days after the onset of the first symptoms, and the dying person spent these days in terrible torment. Physicians of that time were helpless against the plague. They tried to open the buboes to release bad blood, cauterized them with a hot iron, applied poultices of herbs and frog skin. Nothing helped. Doctors wore special suits, long robes of waxed fabric, and masks with beaks, stuffed with aromatic herbs and spices. It was believed that the disease was transmitted through miasmas, poisonous vapors, and the mask was supposed to protect against them. In reality, these measures were useless against the fleas that carried the plague. Cities emptied with frightening speed. In Florence, according to some estimates, about 60,000 people had died by October 1348. The streets were littered with corpses that no one dared to remove. Families locked themselves in their homes, afraid to go out. But the disease penetrated there as well, taking all household members. Parents abandoned sick children. Children left dying parents. Fear of infection was stronger than any family ties. Churches were filled with worshippers who begged God for salvation. Priests held masses day and night, but they themselves became victims of the disease. In some parishes, all the clergy died, and there was no one to bury the dead or confess the dying. People began to lose faith. If God does not answer prayers, if righteous people die the same way as sinners, then what is the point of piety? The epidemic destroyed not only bodies but also the foundations of the medieval worldview. By the beginning of 1349, the plague had spread throughout Europe from north to south and from west to east. The English city of Hereford encountered the disease in January. The first victims appeared imperceptibly, but by April, when the city celebrated Easter, mortality sharply increased. People gathered in churches for festive services, standing close to each other, and fleas infected with the plague moved from one person to another. The peak of the epidemic occurred in July, when the mortality rate reached unprecedented heights. Studies of remains from mass graves in Hereford showed that the plague was particularly ruthless towards young people. Most adult victims were between 15 and 35 years old. Among those buried in collective graves, 34% were people of this age, while in ordinary parish necropolises, their number was only 18%. Young organisms, paradoxically, turned out to be more vulnerable to the infection. Perhaps their immune systems reacted too violently, leading to rapid death. The clergy suffered disproportionately high losses. In the first year of the pandemic in Hereford, 53 clergy members died, 37 times more than in ordinary years. The reason was simple. Priests could not refuse their duties. They came to the dying for confession, performed last rites, buried the dead. Every such action was an act of self-sacrifice, as approaching a sick person almost guaranteed infection. By the end of the epidemic, about 45% of Hereford's population had died. The picture was similar throughout Europe. Villages were completely emptied, all inhabitants died, and there was no one to harvest the fields. Wheat yellowed and fell to the ground. Livestock died of hunger, waiting for their owners. Travelers passing by such villages found only ruined houses and silence, broken by the cawing of crows feasting on corpses. Some places were never resettled, turning into wastelands overgrown with weeds. Cities lost 30 to 60% of their population. The economy collapsed. There was a shortage of labor to till the land, work in craft workshops, and trade. Those who survived unexpectedly discovered that their labor had become much more valuable. Peasants began to demand higher wages, refusing to work for their former pay. Feudal lords tried to maintain the old order by force, issuing laws that fixed wages at pre-epidemic levels. But this only led to discontent and riots. The plague made no distinction between rich and poor, noble and commoner. Kings and princes died just like beggars. Alfonso X of Castile died of plague during the siege of Gibraltar in 1350. Joan, daughter of the French king, died en route to Navarre, where she was to be married. Neither wealth nor power could protect against the invisible enemy that penetrated castles and palaces as easily as it did the huts of the poor. Some tried to escape. Wealthy townspeople fled to their country estates, hoping that the disease would not reach them in the countryside. Giovanni Boccaccio, in his Decameron, described a group of young Florentines who took refuge from the plague in a villa outside the city and entertained themselves by telling stories. But this was merely a literary fantasy. In reality, escape rarely helped. People carried the disease with them, and it caught up with them in their new location. When reason cannot find an explanation for a catastrophe, it seeks scapegoats. Medieval society, shaken to its foundations by the plague, turned its fear and anger against those who had always been outsiders, the Jews. Rumors spread through the cities and villages of Europe that the Jews had poisoned the wells to destroy the Christians. These accusations were absurd. Jews died of the plague just like everyone else. But the mob, gripped by panic, did not listen to reason. In 1349, pogroms against Jews began. In Strasbourg, in February of that year, about 2,000 Jews were burned at the stake on a specially constructed platform. They were accused of confessing under torture to poisoning the water. In reality, under sufficient torture, a person will confess to anything. Similar massacres occurred in Frankfurt, Mainz, Cologne, and other cities. Entire Jewish communities were annihilated. Their property was plundered, their synagogues burned. Pope Clement VI, residing in Avignon, issued 2 papal bulls condemning the pogroms and explaining that Jews suffered from the plague just as Christians did. Therefore, the accusations against them were unfounded. He urged believers to cease violence and pointed out that the true cause of the disaster was God's wrath for the sins of humanity. However, these appeals had limited effect. In some regions, the pogrom stopped, but in many others, they continued with the same cruelty. Another category of scapegoats were lepers. They had already been feared and despised. But during the plague, hatred towards them reached its peak. Lepers were accused not only of spreading leprosy but also of intentionally infecting healthy people out of malice and vindictiveness. In some places, mobs stormed leper colonies and killed the sick, not even waiting for a trial. The hunt for lepers was carried out with particular zeal between the 10th and 11th centuries. The persecution was carried out by members of the clergy and magistrates, who were far removed from medical practice. The ultimate goal of these proceedings was not the isolation and treatment of the sick, but their physical elimination. A leper could be declared as such on the basis of the most superficial signs: skin ulcers, pallor, changes in voice. Many of those declared lepers actually suffered from other diseases: tuberculosis, smallpox, typhus. But the diagnosis of leprosy was an unappealable sentence. Groups of flagellants, religious fanatics, also emerged, who walked from town to town, publicly whipping themselves as penance for humanity's sins. They believed that the plague was a punishment for sins, and only through physical suffering could God be appeased. The flagellants gathered in squares and staged performances, undressing to the waist and lashing themselves with whips, in which pieces of metal and glass were woven, until blood flowed in streams. Spectators wept and prayed. Some joined the procession. The church initially tolerated the flagellants, seeing in them a manifestation of religious fervor. However, the movement soon got out of control. The flagellants began to preach that their suffering was more important than church sacraments, that they could absolve sins themselves without the mediation of priests. They criticized the clergy for corruption and wealth, and called for violence against Jews and heretics. In 1349, Pope Clement VI condemned the flagellant movement and ordered it suppressed. Many of them were arrested and executed as heretics. Medieval medicine was completely helpless in the face of the plague. Physicians did not understand the nature of the disease and could not offer effective treatment. Their knowledge was based on the ancient theory of humors, according to which health depended on the balance of 4 fluids in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. It was believed that the plague arose from an excess of black bile and bad vapors, miasmas, emanating from decaying organic matter, swamps, and filth. The main method of treatment was bloodletting. A doctor would open a vein in the patient's arm with a sharp lancet, and blood would drain into a special bowl. The procedure could be repeated several times, and the patient lost a significant amount of blood. This, naturally, did not help with the plague, but only weakened the patient, hastening their death. But doctors were convinced of the method's correctness. If the patient died, it meant the disease was too strong. If they recovered, it meant the bloodletting had helped. Another popular method was applying leeches to the site of the buboes. Leeches sucked blood, and, as it was believed, the disease along with it. In practice, this only led to additional suffering for the patient. Some doctors tried to open the buboes with a scalpel, releasing pus and blood. Then they cauterized the wound with a hot iron or poured boiling oil into it. The pain from such procedures was unbearable, and many patients died not from the plague but from shock. All sorts of concoctions and mixtures were used. Physicians prepared decoctions of wormwood, juniper, rue, adding crushed pearls, ground precious stones, and gold. It was believed that the more expensive the ingredients, the stronger the medicine. Patients were given these potions to drink, their bodies were smeared with them, and enemas were administered. Some recipes were frankly disgusting. For example, an ointment made of ground frogs, snake fat, and human excrement, which was prescribed to be rubbed into the buboes. Doctors wore special protective suits that became a symbol of the epidemic. A long robe of waxed or oiled fabric covered the body from head to toe. Gloves were worn on the hands, and the face was hidden by a mask with a long beak. Inside the beak, aromatic substances were placed: camphor, lavender, mint, spices. It was believed that the strong smell would ward off miasmas and protect against infection. The doctor held a wooden staff, which he could use to touch the patient from a distance, without getting too close. In reality, these precautions were useless against bubonic plague, which was transmitted by the bite of fleas. Fleas lived on rats, but when a rat died of the plague, they moved to humans. The bite of an infected flea introduced bacteria into the bloodstream, and the disease began. Medieval physicians did not know about the existence of bacteria or the role of vectors. They did not understand that rats, which abounded in medieval cities, were the main cause of the epidemic spread. Some measures taken by the authorities were incidentally effective. In the Italian city-states, quarantine was introduced, isolating arriving ships and travelers for 40 days. If no one among the passengers or crew fell ill during this time, the ship was allowed into port. This measure helped slow the spread of the plague, although its rationale was incorrect. It was believed that miasmas dissipated within 40 days, rather than the incubation period of the disease expiring. By 1353, the first wave of the Black Death had receded, leaving behind a devastated continent. According to various estimates, 30 to 60% of Europe's population died from the disease. It was a demographic catastrophe of unprecedented scale. Tens of millions of people died in a few years. Entire regions were depopulated. Cities shrank to the size of villages. The consequences of the epidemic were felt for centuries and changed the course of European history. Europe's economy collapsed. There were not enough people to farm the land, harvest crops, or work in workshops. Entire villages stood empty. Fields became overgrown with weeds. Feudal lords, having lost most of their peasants, could no longer force them to work under the old terms. Peasants, realizing the value of their labor, began to demand higher wages and better living conditions. This led to a series of uprisings: the Jacquerie in France in 1358, the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. The feudal system, based on a rigid hierarchy and the attachment of peasants to the land, began to crumble. Many peasants fled their lords and hired themselves out to other landowners who offered better conditions. Authorities tried to stop this process legislatively. In England, the Statute of Laborers was passed, fixing wages at pre-epidemic levels. In France, similar ordinances were issued, but these laws were difficult to enforce due to the labor shortage. The plague also changed the social structure of society. Many noble families died out. Their lands and titles passed to distant relatives or simply to those who managed to seize them. New wealthy individuals emerged from the ranks of merchants and artisans who were able to take advantage of the economic chaos. Social boundaries became more permeable. Although the aristocracy desperately resisted change, society became more mobile and less rigid. The church lost a significant part of its authority. Many people asked, why did God allow such a catastrophe? Why did he not answer the prayers of the faithful? Why did the righteous die the same way as sinners? These questions undermined the foundations of medieval religiosity, which asserted a direct link between piety and God's mercy. Heretical movements emerged, criticizing the church for its wealth and corruption, demanding a return to apostolic poverty. The clergy suffered heavy losses. Priests, monks, and nuns died in disproportionately large numbers because they could not refuse their duties to the sick and dying. After the epidemic, the church experienced an acute shortage of clergy. People who were less educated and less devoted to their calling filled the vacant positions. The quality of the clergy declined, further undermining the church's authority. The plague did not disappear forever after 1353. It returned again and again, flaring up every 10 to 15 years. These subsequent epidemics were less devastating than the first wave, but still claimed thousands of lives. Europe lived under the constant threat of a new outbreak, and this sense of uncertainty about the future permeated all of society. People became more acutely aware of the fragility of life and the proximity of death, which was reflected in the art and literature of the era. In the heart of medieval Europe, amidst narrow city alleys with shuttered windows and smoking fireplaces, an invisible misfortune slowly but relentlessly knocked on every door. Smallpox, a disease whose course in history is marked by tens of millions of deaths, disfigured faces, disrupted dynasties, and silent poverty, had been a scourge for any community from ancient times until the modern era. The main causative agent of smallpox was a virus, known by the Latin name variola, or the variola virus. It was transmitted surprisingly easily. A coughing and sneezing person would infect others rapidly. Sometimes even simple conversation could be fatal. In addition to the air, danger lurked in household items, clothing, dishes, even unwashed bedsheets. The disease knew no distinctions. A child, a peasant, a countess, or a prince. The virus devoured all living things with equal ruthlessness. For a person who had never encountered smallpox, death loomed suddenly. The illness began like a common cold. By evening, a fever would rise, accompanied by aching joints, a severe headache, and sometimes nausea. 2 or 3 days later, red spots would appear on the chest and face. By evening, there were up to a dozen, and by the morning of the second day, hundreds. The rash turned into dense, painful pustules filled with clear, then cloudy fluid. The body itched and burned, seeming engulfed in flames. This painful beauty quickly transitioned into a phase of decomposition. The pustules clouded, began to suppurate, burst, emitting a putrid odor. The worst part was that in most patients, the rash covered not only the face and body but also the internal mucous membranes, tongue, gums, throat, palate. A child would begin to suffocate. An adult could not eat, drink, or speak. The fever lasted 5 to 7 days. The person could not sleep, sweated profusely, and found no rest even for a short time. Patients lay unconscious, sometimes delirious from fever. People thrashed about, tearing off their clothes. The pain was unbearable. The burning destroyed their will. When the dangerous week passed, some managed to survive. Then the second circle of torment began. The skin cracked, the pustules burst, pus flowed onto the pillow, leaving black stains. The patient lost large pieces of skin. Deep, round scars remained on the body for life. For women and girls, smallpox was a tragedy no less than death. Beautiful faces were transformed into a pitted network of scars. The most beautiful maidens awoke with a map of death instead of their faces. Complications born from smallpox were particularly terrible. Many children went blind if the rash affected the cornea. Adults suffered from inflammation of internal organs, hearing loss, and joint damage. Those who survived often became cripples. But very few managed to survive. 1 in 3 victims died. Mortality among children was even higher. Chronicles recorded years when cities lost up to half of their newborns. In royal houses, heirs were buried one after another. Succession lines were disrupted. Family hopes were shattered. In France during the reign of Louis XV, thousands of children were buried every summer. In cities in Germany and England, it was rare to meet a person who did not have at least one trace of smallpox on their face. Smallpox played a particularly sinister role in historical events. It was this disease that claimed a significant portion of the population of North and South America when European conquistadors arrived there. But even in Europe itself, the virus showed no mercy. Every 2 to 3 years, new waves erupted. According to the records of physicians and chroniclers of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, up to 1.5 million people could die annually in France alone. In individual provinces, up to 40,000 per year. Medieval physicians, knowing neither virology nor immunology, tried to treat smallpox with available means. The primary belief was bloodletting. It was thought that the disease exited with bad blood. The procedure was repeated until exhaustion, which often killed the patient faster than smallpox itself. Enveloping the patient in red fabric was practiced. Doctors were obliged to keep red curtains and tablecloths in the room and wrap children in red ribbons. It was believed that the color drew out the disease and repelled the fever. Another custom was to keep vinegar with a soaked sponge or herbs by the bedside and fumigate the room with burning juniper branches. Sometimes processions walked along the streets, people carrying icons and candles, invoking the intercession of heavenly patrons. The most desperate resorted to black magic, made amulets, drew protective signs on doors, and read special incantations. In daily life, every mother met her child's cough with trepidation. Any spot on the skin, a rise in temperature was considered a fatal mark. Smallpox turned maternity wards and children's bedrooms into places of fear. Ancestors long remembered every case. Even decades later, stories of those events were passed down to grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Among adults, those who had survived the disease in childhood were respected, but those who lived to adulthood without having had it lived in constant anxiety and apprehension. The development of cities only intensified the spread of the disease. Quarters with narrow alleys, where families huddled in tens of people in damp rooms, created ideal conditions for smallpox. Unsanitary conditions, lack of hygiene, meager food, and constant crowding. Everything worked for the victory of the virus. The most terrible were the smallpox epidemics among the nobility. History remembers how Maria II of England died in torment. Emperors fell ill. Entire dynasties disappeared due to sudden illness. The chronicles echo with horror. Smallpox entered the city, and in a week wiped out a third of the children. In years when there were not enough graves in the cemetery, white signs with the image of a pustule were hung at the entrances to cities. A quarantine sign, prohibiting entry and exit. Isolation was ineffective. As soon as the first person fell ill in a house, by the end of the week, everyone was sick. Family members had their hair cut, clothes burned, dishes discarded, the premises washed with lye and ash, and aired out by draft. Nevertheless, such measures hardly saved them from disaster. Only at the end of the 17th century, after long centuries of despair, did the first real means of prevention appear: variolation, the inoculation of pus from a patient's pustule under the skin of a healthy person. The method was dangerous, often unsuccessful, but it gradually reduced mortality. Later, Edward Jenner discovered vaccination with cowpox, and, despite the horrors passed down through generations, it was the victory over smallpox that became one of medicine's greatest achievements. This victory was born on the bones of millions, in the moans of mothers, in prayers and terrible nights, but it showed that even the most ancient calamities were subject to human control, if one did not surrender to the worst that blind chance and merciless nature could send. Tuberculosis, known in the Middle Ages as typhus, was a quiet and insidious killer that did not launch swift raids or devastate cities in a single week, like plague or smallpox. It was a disease of patience, pain, and long anticipation of the end. Its causative agent is a special bacterium, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, an invisible enemy without smell or taste, but a favorite companion of crowded, damp, unventilated dwellings. In those times, no one understood the nature of this. There was no concept of microbes or airborne transmission. The disease was simultaneously linked to witchcraft, curses, the evil eye, and hereditary weaknesses. Tuberculosis was not only a physical ailment but also a fatal shadow over entire families. Old people in the courtyards would whisper, "That family already coughs blood. That girl is from the weak lineage, consumptive, and no one hoped for a happy outcome." The onset of the disease was almost imperceptible. At first, a person began to tire faster than usual, felt feverish in the evenings, woke up sweating, complained of weakness. After a few weeks, a dry cough appeared, initially mild, then alarming. Morning cough, with bloody sputum. With each month, the cough became more frequent. Shortness of breath appeared. Seizures plagued the nights. The patient could not lie on their side. Every breath caused agonizing pain. Priests and doctors called phthisis a disease of thinning lungs. It seemed as if the person was burning from within, becoming transparent. Their face thinned, cheekbones sharply protruded, skin became thin, and fingers and neck elongated. Girls with this disease were sometimes envied. Pallor, transparent veins, slowness, a shy gaze seemed, to the taste of the time, signs of refinement. Almost a communion with the angelic world. But behind this romanticization lay sleepless nights, tormented bodies, a hopeless look at loved ones. Symptoms could develop over years. Both men and women were susceptible to the disease, but young people suffered most often. Cramped monastic communities, boarding schools, city slums. Here the air was stagnant, dampness lingered for weeks, and windows were rarely opened. Transmission occurred through breathing. Even if the sick person did not show acute signs, bacteria already entered the organs of everyone who lived nearby. It was the longevity and painful silence of typhus that made it particularly terrifying for loved ones. It could not be escaped by fleeing, unlike the plague, which often struck visitors or newcomers. Pythises grew in the very heart of the family. It killed one by one. First, energy disappeared, then interest in life. Food lost its taste, muscles weakened, hair fell out in clumps, skin became flabby. The patient wasted away before one's eyes, unable to escape. Sometimes they were bedridden for months, and sometimes they rushed out into the street in fits of fever, frightening neighbors with their appearance and cough. The mortality rate of tuberculosis was severe. In conditions of medieval poverty and the absence of systematic medicine, up to half of all those infected died. From time to time, grim entries appeared in chronicles. Entire monasteries became empty because all their inhabitants wasted away in suffocating fevers. The disease decimated entire craft guilds, especially among weavers, jewelers, scribes, and musicians, those who worked in cramped, poorly ventilated rooms. Medieval medicine was powerless. Patients were advised to move to the countryside, to enjoy the clean air of high altitudes, rest in pastures, and consume strengthening food, meat, milk, and eggs. Doctors prescribed herbs, decoctions of wormwood, infusions of elecampane, a collection of linden flowers with honey. Sometimes bath procedures or alcohol rubs were prescribed. Bloodletting was rarely used, as consumptives were too weak for this procedure. In daily life, families tried to warm the patient's room and place the bed by the window. In church schools and monasteries, night vigils were held and candles were offered in the hope of alleviating agony. Hopes for a miracle were almost non-existent. If a chest disease entered a house, it was considered that the following year would end with a funeral. Often after the death of one person, another fell ill, and entire courtyards became empty. The graves of consumptives were placed on the outer edges of the cemetery, sometimes even grouped by the occupation of the sick, so that no one would transfer the bad illness to another home. In people's minds, typhus left its mark both as a mystical punishment and as an eternal shadow of routine poverty. It deprived people of their last possessions: strength, beauty, money, and love. For decades, family legends accumulated about the torments of a grandmother who died in the throes of a cough, about a boy who did not survive his first spring. This sad, slow drama became the backdrop for almost any ordinary urban and rural fate, and even the victory over the plague remained incomplete. Where death was swift, tuberculosis slowly sucked and twisted the soul inside out. The consequences of typhus were so all-encompassing that even after the epidemic subsided, traditions were maintained in homes: more frequent ventilation, moving to the village for the summer, avoiding throat injuries, not living in dampness for long, strengthening children's health from infancy. This fear of a long and imperceptible death was passed from mouth to mouth, becoming part of oral law. This is why, later, the first discovery of the nature of tuberculosis, which would occur only in the 19th century, would become one of the most important events for all of Europe. But for the people of the Middle Ages, typhus remained a quiet, sad death, as inevitable as autumn, as evening, as the memory of silence. Among the many ancient scourges that tormented Europe, a special place is occupied by typhus, a disease that was often popularly called red fever due to the characteristic spotted rash that covered the patient's body. Despite its calm name, typhus was one of the era's most terrible enemies. Its appearance threatened the death of entire cities, armies, and monastic communities. The causative agent of typhus was the bacterium Rickettsia proezekii, an invisible parasite that lived in the internal organs of humans. The main vector was ordinary lice, small insects that knew no social or age distinctions. They easily infested the rich beds of nobles and the ragged shirts of the poor alike, where clothes were not washed for years, and people lived crowded together on straw or thick, sweat-soaked mattresses. Lice multiplied with incredible speed. Typhus was inseparable from war, famine, and devastation. Wherever households were destroyed and people did not wash for weeks, it appeared almost inevitably. With the onset of cold weather or military hardships, families crammed into a single room, shared straw mattresses or pallets, exchanged clothes, and thus the disease spread widely. Often, after a poor harvest or hard years, rumors spread through villages. The Red Death has begun in our settlement. In Munster last week, 14 bodies with fever were carried out. The history of typhus in Europe has many tragic chapters. Already during the Crusades, epidemics are mentioned that wiped out up to half the population of fortresses and army camps. Later, during the sieges of cities, the first wave of deaths was always brought not by the sword, but by disease. If people with fever appeared on the streets, then in the following weeks, a wave of deaths was expected. Typhus symptoms developed rapidly. Initially, a person felt weakness, headache, fever, and shivering throughout the body. On the third or fourth day, a bright red spotted rash appeared all over the body, especially noticeable on the back, abdomen, and sides. The temperature rose to 40 degrees. Consciousness became confused. The patient began to rave, see hallucinations, and often suffered amnesia. Excessive thirst and dehydration quickly depleted the body. In severe cases, limbs swelled and blackened. The heart pounded erratically. Breathing became hoarse. The duration of the illness was unpredictable. In some, the condition worsened on the 6th or 7th day. In others, death occurred 2 weeks after the first signs. Sometimes a patient unexpectedly lost consciousness quickly and died in the middle of the night, causing panic throughout the family. Few survived, but even months later, the recovered remained weak, unable to work, and suffered from exhaustion for a long time. Typhus most severely affected children, women, and the elderly. Monasteries and army hospitals became breeding grounds for the epidemic. Chronicles recorded that in the 15th century, typhus destroyed up to half of the soldiers in French and Spanish armies, more than all battles and sieges combined. In Leiden, 5,000 people were buried in 1 year. In Hamburg, up to 20,000 inches one winter. In most of the medieval world, even the most experienced physicians lost the battle against typhus. Doctors tried to avoid entering the rooms of the sick, unless absolutely necessary. It was believed that the disease was transmitted through a bad spirit emanating from pus and the rash. If one of the household members fell ill, all the family achieved was to isolate them in a separate room, and after recovery, burn the bed and clothes. In some places, customs of fumigating dwellings with juniper, bay leaf, or burning pine needles and incense were practiced. But these measures only provided psychological relief. Perhaps the most effective was the implementation of red quarantines, several weeks of complete isolation of a village from the outside world. Streets fell silent, gates were chained, merchants bypassed them. Hunger and fear of each other sometimes became no less terrible than the disease itself. Chronicles noted more than once that the same families died of hunger and typhus in one winter. Professional medics advised rubbing the body with vinegar, making compresses from infusions of sage and rosemary, giving patients diluted wine, and sometimes even using opium infusions to relieve pain. But there was no experience, and not only the poor died, but also high-ranking monks and noble commanders. As happened in the 15th century with the army of Francis I during the siege of Naples, alongside the horrifying losses of war, typhus taught Europe the most terrible lesson: suspicion and closure. After numerous epidemics, residents became wary of any new family, visiting travelers, strangers, and demanded certificates, investigated traces of illness, developed hygienic habits, even simple hand-washing, changing clothes, airing rooms, which later laid the foundation for the sanitary revolution. The life of a medieval person was immersed not only in fear of the great plagues, plague, smallpox, typhus, and leprosy, but also in less noticeable but equally merciless enemies that invariably claimed lives, destroyed families, and lurked behind every door. Among them, a special place is occupied by so-called childhood diseases: malaria, diphtheria, whooping cough, measles, scarlet fever, which shaped the rhythm of ordinary daily misery, almost habitual in urban and rural environments. Malaria, known to chroniclers as marsh fever, spread in warm and humid regions of Europe, southern France, Italy, the Balkans. There was no scientific explanation for the disease. Evil vapors from the swamp, rotten grass, and stagnant water were blamed. Local residents avoided the lowlands, especially as heat set in, and tried to build houses on elevations near windy hills. The true cause of the disease would be discovered many centuries later: simple parasites, Plasmodium, which entered the human bloodstream through the bite of a mosquito that fed on the blood of a sick person and then transmitted the infection to others. Malaria began innocently: slight weakness, headache, unpleasant sensations throughout the body. After a few days, the patient developed chills, followed by a high fever with bouts of heat and profuse sweating, recurring every 2 or 3 days. During the crisis, the skin became covered in sweat, the person shivered, breathing became difficult. Sometimes delirium and severe convulsions occurred, especially frightening for children. By the end of the bout, The temperature dropped sharply, leaving complete exhaustion and weakness. After several such cycles, the patient weakened and lost their appetite. The fever returned again and again, sparing even the strongest. In infants, the disease often led to death within weeks. Treatment methods were agonizing and ineffective. The doctor recommended the patient relocate to the hills, drink wine with herbs, and rub themselves with garlic and onions. Sometimes, rooms were fumigated with juniper, mint, and streaked John's wort, and decoctions of oak and wormwood were prepared. In particularly severe years, entire villages remained abandoned until autumn. People went to relatives in the north or moved their children to temporary settlements where the risk of illness was lower. Childhood throat diseases, diphtheria, and whooping cough struck young children without warning. Diphtheria was caused by a bacterium, Corynebacterium diphtheriae, which medieval physicians could not detect but knew well from its monstrous manifestations. The disease began with a sore throat, burning, and hoarseness. After a day or two, the voice became hoarse, breathing difficult. The mucous membranes of the throat swelled and became covered with a whitish coating or membrane. The child suffocated, turning blue before their eyes. It happened that infants died in the middle of the night, not even waiting for dawn. Lack of air, suffocation, fear, and panic. This is what the parents of these children saw. Hot milk with honey was often advised to drink. Hot compresses were applied to the neck. None of the traditional practices helped to cope with the real threat. Whooping cough, caused by the bacterium Bordetella pertussis, was no less terrifying. Infants and children aged 3 to 5 years fell ill most often in the cold season. The disease began with a mild cough, resembling a cold, but by night, the seizures became unbearable. A spasmodic, barking cough that led to screaming, vomiting, with a prolonged whistling inhalation. Nights acquired a specific sound, and mothers could immediately distinguish the illness by their child's cough. Often, frightened prayers were heard in homes at night. Children choked in seizures, sometimes suffocating if they lacked the strength to inhale. Doctors prescribed decoctions of oregano and mint, placed cupping glasses on their backs, and sometimes sent the child into the fresh air to the nearest grove or to a country house. Besides malaria, diphtheria, and whooping cough, measles, scarlet fever, and rubella raged among children. Measles led to high fever, weakness, purplish spots all over the body, sometimes loss of vision and hearing. Scarlet fever was characterized by a diffuse rash, sore throat, and rapid spread in children's groups. Of 10 newborns, only 1 in 2 lived to the age of 10. In years marked by epidemics, villages and urban educational institutions were emptied. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of children's graves appeared in one season. Medieval life adapted to the hostile reality. Mothers tied red threads around their children's necks, placed balls of wormwood, parsley, and garlic cloves under their pillows. At the first signs of illness, a rag doll or a red flag was hung on the door, a sign of an unfortunate home. The father brought special powders from the physician, but they believed primarily in the power of prayer, mother's love, protection of lineage, and incantations. Childhood diseases were monstrously common but considered almost an inevitable, necessary test of the resilience of families, lineages, and villages. Medical science, not yet freed from the embrace of tradition and magic, was powerless against these afflictions. Child mortality remained colossal until the 19th century, and only with the development of hygienic knowledge, the construction of schools with separate classrooms and maternity wards, did the situation begin to improve. Of all the diseases of the Middle Ages, leprosy, also called lepra in the chronicles, was surrounded by the thickest aura of fear and prejudice. Unlike plague, smallpox, or typhus, leprosy rarely caused instant death, but slowly and inexorably erased a person from life, separated them from family, relatives, work, and society, dooming them to isolation, to existence behind walls. The causative agent of the disease was Mycobacterium leprae, which likely appeared in Europe from eastern lands where leprosy had been known since antiquity and the Middle East. With the beginning of the Crusades, when thousands of people crossed different climatic zones and came into contact with new foci of infection, the disease penetrated the cities of France, Germany, Spain, and Italy, spreading from seaports to distant villages. The symptoms of leprosy developed over years. First, A person noticed strange numbness in their limbs, the appearance of spots and nodules on the skin, yellowish, white, sometimes red. Then the skin lost sensitivity, and the ulcers that appeared began to fester, grow, and destroy tissue. Limbs became crooked, deformed, fingers, joints, and feet gradually rotted and fell off. The face acquired a leonine appearance, thick supraorbital ridges, swollen lips. The nose lost its shape. The features became large, as if coarse. Due to the damage to nerve endings, the voice became hoarse, the timbre changed. Sometimes the patient lost sight, eyelids could not close, eyes dried out, and ulcers appeared on the cornea. The most severe ordeal for a leper was not only physical suffering but also complete alienation. In the Middle Ages, the disease was considered not only biological but also spiritual. It was seen as punishment for secret or overt sins, retribution for schism, heresy, broken vows, or dubious deals. Therefore, even with the slightest suspicion, a person underwent a public ritual of deathbed service. They came to church, where they were dressed in black, plain clothes. A funeral for the living was performed over them. A final prayer was read, and they were declared dead to society. After this, the leper was forced to wear special clothing, a hooded cloak to hide the disfigured face. A bell was hung around their neck, so that those they encountered could hear their approach and have time to move away. Walking on city streets without signaling was strictly forbidden. Violators could be beaten, exiled, and sometimes even executed. Communion, marriage, inheritance, participation in society, everything became impossible. The path for such people led to leper colonies, special shelters, the construction of which was facilitated by monastic orders, charitable societies, and authorities. Outside the city walls or on the borders of villages, grim stone buildings arose, surrounded by high fences or moats, and a separate, closed life was established within them. In France alone, by the 10th century, up to 2,000 leper colonies were in operation. Large cities in Germany and England had several such institutions, served by brotherhoods of mercy. The sick had separate dining halls, chapels, primitive infirmaries, and sometimes plots of land where meager vegetables were grown. Monks, itinerant physicians, and members of hospital brotherhoods undertook the care of the unfortunate. They prepared ointments from decoctions of sage, rosewater, chickweed, and anise, treated ulcers with infusions of honey and vinegar, sometimes used decoctions of celandine and wormwood, and tried to alleviate suffering, but did not hope for a cure. Few recovered. Most of the sick lived for years in slow decline, gradually losing strength, hearing, sight, and mobility. Within the leper colonies, there was its own hierarchy. Older patients helped look after new arrivals, maintained cleanliness in the premises, and organized joint work. Sometimes friendships, mutual sympathy, and even celebrations arose between neighbors, with meager meals, shared singing, and joint rituals. But the longing for the free world always remained. Letters home were rarely delivered, permission for visits was granted infrequently, and meetings with relatives could only occur through a grate or from a significant distance. Death in the leper colony was considered a daily event. The deceased were buried in a separate part of the cemetery, often without a service, only with a brief prayer. Graves were marked not with a cross, but with a simple post or stone, nameless. It was believed that the name of the dead could bring misfortune to the healthy. The fate of a leper's family was often tragic. Spouses were obliged to divorce. Children lost their right to inheritance. Property went to the city magistrate or religious community. The house was burned or left empty for many years. Relatives tried to pray for the sick, brought modest gifts to the leper colonies, bread, vegetables, sometimes old clothes, but rarely hoped to see a recovery. For many centuries, leprosy remained a mystery. Chronicles recorded constant waves of illness. In each generation, new patients appeared. Official documents strictly prohibited lepers from participating in festivals, visiting markets, or participating in legal proceedings. Only in the 19th century was the Mycobacterium leprae discovered, and the first attempts at treatment began. And in the 20th century, the disease almost disappeared. For medieval Europeans, leprosy was not so much a medical issue as a test of humanity. The ability to care for the suffering of others, to sympathize with the outcast, to maintain kindness and mercy, became the main answer to fear and prejudice. Life behind the walls of the leper colony became a sad legend, a symbol not only of physical torment but also of society's capacity to be cruel and to learn to become gentler, more receptive, and wiser. Gradually, by the end of the 15th century, the continuous series of epidemics and medical calamities had changed the mood in various strata of European society. People, tired of living in fear of invisible enemies, began to ask questions about the nature of diseases, not only to pray, suffer, and await a punishing fate, but also to seek explanations, observe, and record what was happening to the body and soul of the sick. The slow evolution of knowledge, born on the ruins of devastated cities and villages, became a crucial characteristic of the late Middle Ages. The first hospitals began to appear in large cities. They were opened by Benedictines, Franciscans, and later by wealthy merchants and craft guilds. Unlike the leper colonies and isolation wards of previous eras, these hospitals were less like prisons. Here, not only the poor and crippled but also merchants, women, children, and apprentices could receive help. Hospitals were located near monasteries or cathedrals, often outside the hustle and bustle of the city, but within reach for sending the deceased to the cemetery. Waves of illness forced physicians to gradually move away from magical and religious methods. A more attentive approach to observation, keeping records of symptoms, attempts to systematize signs and outcomes, and documenting treatment and care methods began to spread through educational and monastic treatises. Physicians, not pharmacists, played a special role. They collected plants, dried herbs, made complex mixtures, and gave advice to various social classes. Even ordinary artisans learned to distinguish a cold from typhus, smallpox from scarlet fever, and to understand the development of a disease, at least by external signs. The spirit of research finally broke through with the advent of the Renaissance. In several university chairs, first in Bologna, then in Padua, Paris, and Oxford, the first anatomical dissections began to be performed. These procedures were often met with resistance from the Church. Dissection of the body was considered to defile the soul and violate the integrity of human divine nature. Dissections were most often conducted secretly at night, sometimes on the bodies of executed criminals, the poor, or those found in city canals and suburban ditches. Medical treatises were copied by hand. In addition, Arabic works of Avicenna reached Europe along with Latin translations from Spain. Learning anatomy, the properties of plants, and hygiene principles became not only a church but also a civic duty. The authorities understood that without a systematic approach to diseases, it was impossible to preserve the population, economy, and stability of cities and states. In villages, groups of men and women were formed who went from house to house, airing out rooms, helping the sick, burning infected clothing, caring for children, and spreading simple advice on personal and public hygiene. Any urban community learned to manage water, build sewage systems, and separate wells for drinking and latrines. Everyday care for cleanliness became a habit. This is how the foundations for the sanitary reforms of future centuries were laid. Gradually, knowledge was passed from mouth to mouth, from books to hands. Collections of recipes, complex and simple herbal remedies, descriptions of bloodletting techniques, and preparation of medicinal food became part of domestic life. Mothers taught daughters to boil decoctions, fathers to maintain cleanliness, and children from childhood learned the rituals of house cleaning, wound treatment, and cold prevention. Monastery schools were considered the most advanced, where books by ancient and Eastern authors such as Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna, and Paracelsus were preserved. Physicians and students learned to distinguish fever from chills, ulcers from leprosy, and studied the new properties of familiar plants. By the 10th, 15th centuries, the first secular physicians began to write not only in Latin but also in vernacular languages. This allowed knowledge to spread throughout Europe. Slow but noticeable changes occurred in daily life. Furniture became easier to clean, fabrics cheaper to care for. Tables were more often covered with linen or cotton tablecloths, and floors were washed with water mixed with ash or sand. Barbers cut hair shorter to reduce the risk of parasitic infestation, and shoemakers advised wearing leather shoes that facilitated foot hygiene. Every recipe, every invention, every new observation became a step forward against the specter of diseases that had plagued ancestors for years. The slow evolution of knowledge did not completely rid the Middle Ages of fears, prejudices, and myths, but it created the first basis for a future medical revolution, a scientific view of the world and an empirical approach to treatment, care, and prevention. In this slow, agonizing process, European medicine was born, a science based not only on faith and tradition, but also on observation, experience, diligence, memory, and the transmission of knowledge from generation to generation. The transition to the 15th and 16th centuries did not bring Europe relief from diseases. On the contrary, against the backdrop of turbulent social and technological changes, the growth of cities, frequent wars, and the development of trade, epidemics repeatedly reminded themselves with ruthless directness. In large cities in Poland, France, England, and Spain, new outbreaks of plague flared up time and again. A new wave could engulf up to half the population of a quarter or village. The poorest outskirts, where crowding was particularly high, suffered the most. In London at the end of the 15th century, up to 2,000 people were buried in individual weeks. In Paris, the overall mortality from diseases by the mid-15th century was 20 to 40%, a significant portion of which was children. Europe seemed unable to break free from the cycle. There was always too little time for joy between lulls and death. Epidemics swept along trade routes. Sailors and pilots brought new passengers to ports. Fugitives from quarantine accidentally infected entire villages. Seeking at least to halt the spread of the disaster, authorities tightened sanitary measures. Cities introduced isolation rules, created quarantine houses, and obliged residents to report the first signs of plague or smallpox immediately. They ordered cracks in doors to be sealed, spread ash in the streets, and forced residents to kill all stray dogs and cats near their homes, suspecting them of carrying the contagion. Wells were sealed or fumigated. Products from certain regions were completely banned. In some places, special sanitary brigades, health guards, appeared, controlling entry and exit from the city. White or red flags, with images of an anatomical heart or spots, were hung on the gates, so that travelers could know from afar, "Plague here, stop." Doctors were admitted only in special clothing, felt robes with tightly fastened collars, masks with long bird beaks stuffed with bay leaf, mint, and garlic. Alongside the plague, smallpox, malaria, and typhus did not recede. Tuberculosis itself intensified due to increasing urbanization. In villages, despite apparent tranquility, outbreaks of scarlet fever, measles, and whooping cough occurred. The worst was that the death of a child was perceived almost as a seasonal disaster. In some regions of Italy, Spain, and Germany, Russia, local princes and margraves complained to emperors and kings about an unprecedented decline in the number of adult men, the ability to work, and revenue from taxes. And yet, despite fatigue and despair, Europe was becoming different. Hospitals, which first appeared in the late Middle Ages, spread and transformed into city hospitals, where first aid was provided to all who wished, sometimes regardless of social class or gender. Medical fraternities began to record disease statistics, develop quarantine schemes, and call for basic hygiene. Wealthy patrons donated money for the construction of new infirmaries, provision for orphanages, and free treatment for widows and children. A new worldview emerged in the minds of thinking people. If diseases were previously perceived as divine punishment or fate, then increasingly they began to ponder the rational causes of epidemics. Chronicles recorded observations about where people got sick more often, under what conditions, and what helped protect themselves. The first disputes arose among scientists. Was the air truly to blame, or was the cleanliness of water, clothing, and housing important? The appearance of the first vaccinations at the end of the 15th century was a revolution. Before the work of Edward Jenner, variolation was practiced, inoculating a healthy person with pus from a person with a mild form of smallpox. The percentage of victims in these cases was lower than in a natural epidemic, but the method was dangerous and widespread only among the aristocracy or more enlightened layers of society. After Jenner's discovery, when the virus of cowpox was used for vaccination, mortality from real smallpox rapidly began to decrease. This discovery spread throughout Europe in literally a few decades, and by the mid-19th century, deadly smallpox epidemics had virtually disappeared in Western countries. The time for new scientific research had arrived. Scientists began to investigate the nature of viruses and bacteria, introduce the concepts of infection, and develop effective methods of isolation, sterilization of instruments, proper nutrition, and patient care. Architects designed cities with wide streets, regular cleaning, and sewage systems. The sanitary revolution began, and yet, even at the dawn of the modern era, people did not immediately believe in the power of medicine without mysticism. Not a single one of the medieval horrors disappeared from memory. Every family had at least one story about the death of an entire household, about leprosy, about prophecies, about punitive gods who saved a few for something special. But gradually, faith in oneself, in the ability to protect oneself and maintain health, supplanted old fears. Diseases receded into the annals, but they left a deep mark. Not only wounds on bodies, empty spaces in homes, but also the habit of seeking explanations, striving for prevention, and valuing clean water and air. And this habit, born to the ringing of bells during the plague years, became the first center of medical wisdom for the new era, an era of hope, reason, and striving for light. Even after the darkest centuries, the history of medieval diseases is a testament to human vulnerability, and, at the same time, to its strength. People, surrounded by the horrors of epidemics, poverty, and the constant threat of death, found the courage to live, love, raise children, build cities, and create temples. Fear and suffering gave birth to compassion, and the memory of past catastrophes taught them to care for their neighbors. Later, when the last great epidemics had passed, Europe entered a new era, an era of knowledge, discoveries, and unprecedented changes. The lessons taught by plague, leprosy, typhus, and consumption were never completely forgotten. The memory of them lived on for a long time in folk songs, legends, and in the architecture of cities where one can find old leper colonies and mass graves. Concluding this story, I want to remind you that no catastrophe broke the human spirit. Through fear, darkness, and despair, light always broke through. The light of hope, compassion, and the search for a way out even in the most difficult trials.